It's really great to be here, and I'm so inspired by the actions and the work and the connection that I've already felt since I came here last night, and also like to congratulate everyone on the films that we saw this morning. Before I go on, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering, the Gunbangyir people, and also to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And thank you very much. I'm going to throw my bits of paper on the floor. Okay, so I'm here to talk about the big picture. So the big picture really does need to start with Australia, and I'm going to whiz through these slides, but there will be copies of them with my speaking notes available. So I'm very aware that the big picture and the complexity of the system that we're working in could actually take all day or all week, and I don't have that amount of time. So Australia's population is increasing faster than housing supply is being delivered. We've got a population growth rate of about 1.6%, and our population is almost 25 million. We have a high degree of urbanisation, with about 40% of the population living in Melbourne and Sydney, and these city populations are projected to grow immensely in coming years, with Melbourne actually overtaking the population of Sydney. And the impact of that means that people will move out of those cities because they're going to become congested, they're going to become really dense, so people will move to regional towns like Bellingen and Coffs Harbour and other places, so that is really critical in this population growth context. We are a very, very, very rich country. The economy is highly developed and one of the largest mixed market economies in the world. We are the second wealthiest nation in terms of wealth per adult after Switzerland. Australia's total wealth is 9 trillion as of June 2006, and we have not had a recession for 26 years. So there's not many countries in the world that can state those facts. We need to also recognise that we're working in different markets. Just because housing affordability is an issue, it's actually a different issue in every market and every community that we work in or that we live in, because there are unique factors in each of those markets and communities that impact on housing affordability, on whether people can buy homes, the impact on homelessness, the impact on housing stress. And some parts of Australia are actually going through housing slumps, and they've got declining populations, which actually threatens the viability of some of those towns. So we've got this sort of, tension in the system that we actually need to be considering. We also need to make sure that we think about this being focused, and I think Kerry said this earlier, that it is a very Sydney and Melbourne-centric debate. We've actually got to put this area in the context of housing affordability and recognise what is happening in other places, but recognise what we need to do in this place that is different, but also can draw on those statistics. And we're here today in this regional town because everyone, I mean, we saw the stories, we've heard, I've heard stories and, we've seen the videos about real people and how the housing policies and fiscal policies, the tax system is impacting on individuals and communities. So, we already know this, we are in a housing crisis. Despite Australia's wealth, Australia's housing unaffordability is becoming the #1 issue. A few years ago, the government, there was a poll and they asked people, what are your #1 issues that you want government to focus on? And people said health was #1 and housing was #7. 3 years later, they asked the same question. Health is still #1 and housing has gone all the way up to #2. So it's actually impacting more people than it used to. It's impacting those that can no longer enter the housing market. So the Australian dream of owning a home is gone for many people, let alone people that can't afford to rent or people that cannot even find a home. I mean, we saw the stories on the videos. These people are often living in private rental properties with no security of tenure, and some people are paying 60 to 70% of their income in rent. And housing tenure types are also changing, with home ownership decreasing and private renters increasing. So there's now a groundswell of private renters that are living in private rental properties that are paying too much rent. They've got insecure tenure. The legislative frameworks that we have across every state in Australia do not protect tenants. They are more geared towards landlords. So I think Kerry mentioned before the no-cause eviction. That is one of the things that we are at Shelter and the Tenants Union are focusing on looking at. So the lack of supply in this housing crisis might actually seem surprising, because if you look at the stats, Australia has the second highest dwelling completion rates after South Korea, with 8.5 dwellings built per 1,000 persons as of 2015. That's why there's cranes everywhere. But who's living in these houses? You know, they're actually being built for people that are not the people that we're talking about today. They're actually out of reach for low to moderate income earners. And it is also evident that supply alone is not the panacea to this crisis. The numbers are telling us one thing, but the impacts are telling us something else. So this is a real conundrum in the housing policy system. So I can talk about this a bit more in the workshops about the government's role in housing, but the Commonwealth, state and local governments all have different roles and responsibilities in the housing system. And just looking at that is a very simple diagram. It's really much more complex than that, and I was describing this earlier to someone as navigating through spaghetti bolognese. When you're actually in the system and you are trying to navigate local government, state government and Commonwealth government, and it depends on who you're speaking to on the day, what the response will be, and also whether there's a policy change or where we are in the election cycle. All of those things are considerations. Next slide. Okay, Australia, unlike Canada and other countries, does not have a national affordable housing strategy. So the commentators and advocates such as Shelter and National Shelter and others continue to stress to government that as a country we have failed to tackle the housing affordability crisis. And this system failure is impacting on those that are already disadvantaged, and it is gradually impacting on more and more people. So despite our government reaping the windfall gains of our economic growth, and I mean that from a Commonwealth and a state government perspective, it is failing to invest in social and affordable housing. It is choosing to put that money into other places. And in New South Wales, a group of us actually wrote to the Premier about the $2 billion stadiums, and we got a Dear John letter back. So that is the response that we are getting about where are you putting the dollars. So the current levels of capital investment and policy responses at both federal and state levels are simply tweaking at the edges. In New South Wales alone, there's about 130,000 affordable housing homes that are needed today because low-income people, moderate-income people cannot afford to live in the homes that are available. The national campaign, Everybody's Home, and I'd ask everybody to go onto that website, not now because you're not allowed, but go onto that website and join the Everybody's Home campaign, because that is actually asking the Commonwealth Government for 5 asks, which actually relate to everything that has already been said this morning. Home ownership is now dominated by an investment culture. It's actually geared towards investors and speculators. So the tax system, there's billions of dollars going into that system, which could actually be going into social and affordable housing. And last year, the federal budget provided little to the affordable and social housing industry. The biggest measure in the budget last year was the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, which will be administered by the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. And that will provide bond aggregator loans to community housing providers so that they can actually use that money to create more homes. So that is one good thing. I'll just touch on this. I thought it was important to talk about the disturbing trend of homelessness. And I do apologise, but there is one point on this slide that has dropped off, and that is that, that homelessness has increased, so that for every 10,000 Australians, 50 are homeless. But for Aboriginal people, there's 105 per 10,000 people. So it's more than twice as bad for Aboriginal people. They are more impacted and overrepresented in the homelessness figures than anyone. So somebody actually talked about this and said, in a country, this was Guy Johnson, a professor of urban housing and homelessness at RMIT, and I quote, "In a country as prosperous as Australia, this is a disturbing and worrying trend. Why is this happening? I've just talked about money and wealth. We're the second richest country in the world. Why is this happening?" So these are the things we need to be considering. So here's some more data about homelessness in New South Wales, and severely overcrowded dwellings, 16,000, rough sleepers, 2,500, and people living in refuges. It continues to go up. It's actually increased by about 14% since the last census. This slide is looking at home ownership numbers declining, and people that own their own homes. So at least people that do own homes, they've got some security, but more and more people are actually experiencing mortgage stress. So they're actually also at risk of becoming homeless. And the proportion of renters is increasing. This slide actually talks about 25% of households are renters, but that's actually gone up since this was put together, and it's almost 30% now. So this is basically a function of the steady fall in home ownership. And when you look at private renters living in properties with insecure legislative frameworks, that they could actually be evicted for no cause, that is also worrying. This is a reality in Sydney. I don't know where it is, but it's actually, I wanted to get the point across that, you know, the media is flooded with articles about the housing crisis, the rise in homelessness, and also now the impacts on moderate income people. So people are now more and more having to commute long, you know, for long trips to get to work for a long time. So that costs them money, it costs them time, and it impacts on their quality of life and on their family. It actually means that many people cannot live close to work or actually live in the community that they were brought up in. So the problem and the discourse around this has actually gone to a new level. So the affordability issue means that in Sydney and Melbourne, property prices have increased by 70% in the last 5 years. And people, even, you know, police, nurses, ambulance people, you know, paraprofessionals, they are having to commute longer and longer to get to work. So if it's impacting them that earn pretty decent wages, what does that mean for really low-income people? What are they actually doing? How's it impacting on them? The social housing supply has stayed relatively constant over the past decade, despite the population growth and despite the need. And the amount of public housing has decreased over time by about 13,000 dwellings, while the amount of community housing is increased by about 15 to 20,000, depending on which estimates you look at. And that's mainly because of the property transfer that New South Wales government is undertaking. So that figure is quite worrying, because that, you know, based on the population growth and the need, those numbers should actually be going up. The social housing wait list, which only includes people that are actually eligible, and that you have to be on a very low income with complex needs to be on that list these days. And there it is usually between a 10, 15, 20-year wait, depending on which area you live in New South Wales. So this is really worrying, because that figure is now 60,000 households, not people, households that are on that list. I was at a forum in Coffs Harbour yesterday and talking to some people, and they were saying that many of their clients do not even bother to go on this list, because what's the point? I'll be waiting for too long. So I do encourage you to, you know, to get people to go on the list, because we actually need to get more accurate data, and also if a property becomes available that, you know, meets their needs in an area, they might actually be the lucky bingo winner. Okay. So this is a picture of a woman talking about being the working poor. And I've already mentioned that. So it's also now a question of after housing income and people making choices about how many meals they can afford to have, what they can buy for their children, can they afford for their kids to participate in education or extracurricular activities, can they afford to buy a school uniform? So working families are more and more relying on food banks, they're relying on charities and vouchers. And these are working families. These are not people that are on social security benefits. These are people that are struggling every day because they have to pay the rent. If they don't pay the rent, they'll get evicted. So it's a spiral. It's a spiral, and this is broader than housing. This is about poverty. And this is about housing policies, but also broader public policy. So as a housing policy systemic advocate, which I am, it's great to see that this housing debate is really on the agenda. But I think it's only on the agenda because it's no longer only impacting very low-income people. I think it's on the agenda because it's impacting many people that we all know. So those are people that have got voice and that have got agency and that can actually participate in this debate, which is good because it's bad in a way because it's impacting more people, but it actually means there's going to be a groundswell of action. So I just wanted to mention the Rental Affordability Index, which is, it was released in 2015 in the first place, and that's a really great initiative through National Shelter, SGS Economics, and Community Sector Banking. And it's different to the Anglicare Rental Report. It's an interactive tool, and it looks at every LGA and district across Australia, and it looks at different indicators of housing stress. And the next release of that will be on the 23rd of May. So I think for the evidence for the work that you're doing here, it will be a really good tool to engage with. So what's happening in the state of New South Wales for the future? Currently, the New South Wales government is negotiating with the Commonwealth government for the next National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. And I don't know if there will be any additional money in there to meet unmet need or to meet demand, but we'll watch that space, and it's budget time next week, so we'll probably hear something pretty soon. Also, in New South Wales, the Government Social and Affordable Housing Fund is meant to be delivering thousands of new units in coming years, and to date they've only delivered a few hundred. But it's great to see that initiatives like the SAF, or the Social and Affordable Housing Fund, are enabling community housing providers in particular to partner with local government and developers to actually deliver some housing that is social and affordable. The Communities Plus programme is also set to deliver more social and affordable housing, but that's largely in redevelopment sites, and some of the sites that are being planned will be very, very high density. So, for example, the Ivanhoe estate in Sydney had 259 social housing dwellings on 8 hectares. There will be about 3,000 to 3,500 dwellings on that same space after that build is developed. So there's other issues that need to be considered in that programme. The Social Housing Management Transfer Programme is also occurring. So that's actually transferring 14,000 properties for management from the New South Wales State Government to community housing providers. And I know that Coffs Harbour, Bellingen has a package here, and that will be managed by Mission Australia. So that actually means that the community housing sector will have a share of about 32% of social housing across the state after the social housing transfers have occurred. That's not including any of their own properties that they're developing through their own pipelines. So it's really critical that the community housing sector is engaged and involved in any social and affordable housing discussions and developments. And they can also leverage their charitable status to deliver more in partnership with development, because they've got GST, stamp duty, land tax exemptions, so they don't pay all of that in a development as a developer would. So they can actually deliver more bang for their buck, and they're also highly regulated. So that is probably as much as I can say. I'll leave a few of my comments out. But I just want to say that I think that the beauty and the strength of the collective wisdom and knowledge in this room will actually come up with some really great solutions. We know what the answers are. We know what the solutions are, but the challenge for us, I think, is navigating through that system, learning from the evidence, but also looking at the unique features and assets, human assets, land assets, and capabilities that are held within this community and that can be drawn on. I'm really optimistic with this gathering that we really can make a difference. So thank you.